Labvakar, cienījamās dāmas, godātie kungi, viesi Rothko muzeja zālē un Facebook kontā sekotāji. Šodien, svinot Rothko 122. dzimšanas dienu, ir tā unikālā iespēja noklausīties Rothko meitas Keitas Rothko Prizeles sniegto publisko lekciju par sava tēva radošo mantojumu un ilgo juridisko cīņu līdz tā atgūšanai.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, guests of the Rothko Museum. Good evening, our followers online. Today, as we celebrate the 122nd birthday of Mark Rothko, we have the unique privilege of experiencing live and here at the Rothko Museum a public talk by Kate Rothko Prizel, Mark Rothko's daughter, on Mark Rothko's legacy and the long legal and moral campaign to bring back his painting.
Okay. So I first of all should open by saying that I hope I am not disappointing anyone by not presenting, when I say the legacy, a long series of slides of my father's work or transparencies of my father's work, because this talk is really going to be more about the struggle to get his works back for the public after he died. So I will have a few illustrative slides, but most of this will be a little more didactic. So when an artist dies, I think their legacy really is their artwork. And in my father's case, there was a real risk that what he would have considered his entire legacy would be lost when within just about 3 months of his death, his entire estate, all the paintings that were left unsold when he died, particularly not just his later work, but almost all of his earlier work, would have been completely lost to the public when a gallery, a very powerful gallery, which was not just in the United States, but also international, either purchased or held on consignment, in other words, had consigned to them for 12 years the right to sell his paintings to any buyer. And that would have been totally opposed, as I knew, to what my father would have wanted. And it took almost 8 years of gathering information and battling in court in New York City to get the majority of those works back. And I just was going to start with sort of my father's last major project in the mid-60s that he undertook, which was to create a group of paintings for a chapel that was being constructed in Houston, Texas. So this is my father standing in the studio. He had recreated within this very large studio space he had at least 3 walls of this octagonal chapel, which he was going to create, so he could work with several walls at a time and looking at the juxtaposition of the paintings. And this is just a painting, a photograph of the current interior of the Rothko Chapel. And what I like is this is at most hours of the day, a quiet space where people can actually come and meditate and be surrounded with his paintings, which was really exactly what he would have wanted, and in that sense was kind of a pinnacle of his career. And just to show, so following, he completed that commission in the spring of 1966, and following that, the family took a trip to Europe where we spent about 5 weeks in Rome and then went to London. So these are just some family photos from that time. My mother on the left holding my baby, as I would call him, my baby brother, being 13 years younger than I am, and me on the right. And then a photograph of my father. This was the British part of our trip, so he's appropriately having a cup of tea. So this is just to look back on some, very happy days for the family, because the years that followed before my father's death were really very difficult years. First of all, he was plagued by really very severe depression, and this is something which I only learned after his death had actually been something he struggled with in the early 1940s. So this was not completely new for him. maybe a biological problem, but certainly I think was intensified when he had a very serious medical illness develop in the spring of 1968. He almost died from this very serious vascular event, but he was able to avoid surgery, but was placed on very intensive medication for his high blood pressure. And I don't think the significance of the event really, I think, contributed to his depression. I think he was always, to some degree, felt like he was, staring death in the face all the time because it had been such a serious emergency. And in addition, at that time, there were a number of restrictions placed on what he was allowed to paint. And for a while, the doctor said, oh, you can only paint on a very small scale. And at the time, I think that seemed like a very severe restriction for him. He was painting these very large-scale works. But if we look back in retrospect, he actually produced just an incredible collection of small works on paper during that period. So maybe looking back, we can say it was actually quite a prolific time for him. And I think also because, he felt he was sort of anticipating his own death, even though he was only in his early to mid 60s, he began to do some planning for the future. And this is just a picture I chose here of my father in contrast to the other one, a very, depressed looking picture, I think, of my father sort of sitting lonely in his studio in 1969. So I've always, it's one of the last photographs I have of him, and one that is always sort of difficult to look at. So in this process of planning, I think he, as many other artists try to do, particularly more recently, he wanted to set up a foundation with a board of people who were experts, who knew him very well and were experts in art of his period, because he was always very concerned about how his artwork would be placed. Often before he sold a painting, he wanted to really get to know the collector who was going to buy it, be sure they were serious about his work and understood it. I know he did the same thing, for example, before he undertook the chapel mural commission. So that was extremely important to him, and for that reason he wanted to set up this group of experts and formally set up a foundation. And it was significant, and I think significant in retrospect, that he asked my mother to serve as one of the experts on that foundation, and she, being probably too modest a person, turned him down. And it was highly unfortunate given what happened. I think had my mother been a member of that foundation, and if she had lived, things might have turned out very differently early on. Now, he also wrote a will. A will generally, sets out what you want to happen with all of your possessions, and particularly in his case, what he wanted to happen with his paintings. And usually it's a fairly extensive document drawn up by a lawyer. I don't know what things are like in Latvia, but in the US, everything seems to be controlled by the legal profession, and everything seems to wind up in court. And, that's become increasingly true, but I think at this time, artists particularly were comparatively naive on this score. So my father's will, and I'm not meaning it to be readable here, but it was a 2-page document, which might run to 30 pages now, let's say, and was very, it was really an outline of what he wanted. It gave all his works on art to the foundation, as he basically had planned, but he didn't spell out in his will what he wanted done with those works. And as we'll see, he also didn't really spell that out in the documents which were created at the time he created the foundation. So this created great problems down the line. And also the other aspects of it, what he had left to my mother and things, were not as clear as they could be. And interestingly, this will was drawn up not by a lawyer, but by my father's accountant and a man who had sort of served as his financial advisor. But as we shall see, this individual was also one of his executors. And this was one of the reasons that things did not go well with his estate initially. So clearly, there may have been some forethought on the part of this gentleman in drawing up such a sketchy will. And we also know, and this is really more in retrospect than anything I knew at the time, that there were some significant outside pressures on my father, apparently coming probably at least from this financial advisor who had helped to draw up the will, as well as from the gallery that was involved, as we shall see later on in the case. And it seemed to be that my father had been pretty leery of galleries all his life, and I think after he left his second major gallery dealer in the early 1960s, he had basically made the decision to sell works on his own out of his studio rather than rely on a gallery. And when he did draw a contract with this gallery, which was known as Marlborough Gallery, in 1963, it was only to represent him in Europe and not in the United States at all. So he was really being very cautious in the contract he drew up. However, in 1969, the last year of my father's life, when he was really so depressed, he drew up 2 contracts with the Marlborough Gallery, both contracts for sales of a very large number of major works on canvas. And this was, seemed, looking back, extremely out of character for him. And apparently, we now know that he was about to meet on February 25th, a 3rd time, with Marlborough Gallery, or with representatives of Marlborough Gallery, who were actually going to come to his studio and choose works for an additional contract. And we really don't know why. We can only think that perhaps he was being blackmailed by the gallery, but we were never able to determine why. But it was something that I certainly didn't understand at the time of his death. And I think something that may have contributed to his suicide and also may explain some of the events that happened after he died. So actually, on that same morning, in the early hours of the morning at 2 or 3 a.m., my father committed suicide in his studio. And, as I said, how much the anticipation of this 3rd meeting with, and possibly a 3rd contract with the gallery may have played into it, I don't think we'll ever know, but it certainly remains a question. And this is just really to say that despite the, restrictions that had been placed on my father and what seemed like a really severe depression, he was really very prolific in those last years of his life, and perhaps was going in a different direction. The small works he did on paper in the summer of 1968 were very much in keeping with works he had done in the late 1950s on paper. But in the last year, he produced, first of all, a series of black and gray papers on canvas, which one is shown here, and they never, unfortunately, project very well, as well as a series of large works on paper in a similar color vein. And then, to our total surprise, what we discovered after his death was that he had also created a series of much more pastel works on paper. So clearly he was going in a new direction, which we weren't. I was somewhat aware of the dark works on paper, but completely unaware of these pastel works. So it was a real revelation after he died. So, and I'm afraid I'm not going to have a tempting, colorful slide again till the end of the presentation. So, what had gone wrong with my father's planning before he died? Well, first of all, as I pointed out, the will was very poorly written. There were problems with the way he had worded what was left to my mother, because it was unclear whether paintings that were actually in our house at the time he died were to go to my mother or not. And more than that, probably the lack of instructions about the fact there was a foundation and what its purposes were supposed to be was not written into the will. In addition, when he drew up the actual paperwork for the foundation in 1969, he really only focused on a charitable purpose, and certainly every foundation needs to have a charitable purpose, but he really didn't focus at all in that document either on what he wanted to have happen to his paintings. So he was basically relying on long-term friendships, people he had known, and relying on those people who he believed knew what he wanted to carry out his wishes. And that turned out to be an unfortunate decision. As I alluded to, perhaps if he had my mother on the foundation, things might have turned out differently, but that was not what happened. And last of all, he appointed 3 executors, 3 people who he thought were very close friends. And he relied on these people to carry out wishes which he had not really put in writing. And in fact, subsequently, we found out that 2 of the 3 people he had named to carry out his wishes actually had a conflict of interest, because they were also involved with this gallery, with Marlborough Gallery. The 3rd executor, unfortunately, just seemed not to be able to stand up to the other 2 and simply went along with everything that was going on. So this is just pictures of 3 executors. This was Bernard Rice, his longtime accountant and financial advisor. And he was probably, the brains behind everything that was going on with the gallery. Probably he was leading in this respect. He actually held an official position at the gallery, first simply as their accountant and advisor, but then shortly before my father died, he actually became an assistant director of the gallery. This on the left, here's my father on the right. This is another artist, Theodoros Stamos, who had been a friend since the 1950s of my father, and I think my father was relying on both of them to know exactly how concerned he was about placement of his paintings and what his wishes would have been. And this individual also, perhaps because he was offered a one-man show at this very prestigious gallery, which he had not become nearly as well known within the group of abstract expressionists as some of the others. So probably this was something he would not have expected, and this may have been, something which the gallery offered him for going along with what was going to happen. And then this is the 3rd executor, Morton Levine, who was in a different field. He was an anthropologist, but had become very friendly with my father in the 1960s, and again should certainly have known what my father's desires were, and was considered a very close friend, to the extent that he was also named as a guardian for me, and particularly for my brother, who was very young at the time. So, what happened in the immediate aftermath of my father's death was, first of all, I think, rather shockingly, actually, even at my father's funeral, they were already signing necessary paperwork to move ahead with, their becoming official executors and their being able to move on the sale of these paintings. And within 3 months of his death, the 3 executors had signed contracts with Marlborough Gallery first to sell 100 paintings to them outright, and they actually gave the gallery total choice of what 100 paintings they were going to take for that sale, rather than choosing them ahead of time for the gallery. And then all the other paintings were what we say is consigned to the gallery. In other words, the gallery had the right to sell them for 12 years, which is a very long period to give a gallery that right to keep works on consignment, and presumably enough time for them to sell most of those works. And the other thing that stood out about these contracts when more information came to light was that the paintings had been sold at an extremely low price to the gallery. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. And then again, I mean, very sadly, my mother died only 6 months after my father, just very suddenly. And not only was this a terrible shock for the family, because she was actually almost 20 years younger than my father, but also because I think things might have gone very differently had she lived and been more involved. And basically, between his death and May of the next year, so about 15 months, we really had no idea what was going on. I became suspicious in the fall of 1970 because I had met with the 3 executors, and I had said something about wanting whatever I was going to get from my father to be in the form of pictures, and all of a sudden there was silence. And presumably there was silence because there were no pictures at that point that they could possibly have given me. But I was simply suspicious, and I began to press to try to get more information. But my hands were a little bit tied because I was not considered legal age. So everything I had to do had to be done through another individual who would then, act for me. So at any rate, we did not really find out about the contracts having been signed until May of 1971, by which time the gallery had already started to sell many of these works that they had either purchased or taken on consignment. And this is just Frank Lloyd, the head of Marlborough Gallery on the left. And in this picture, it's telling because on the right is the head of the Metropolitan Museum in New York at the time. And I can only say that they had a very close relationship. And generally, relationships between museum directors and people who run galleries isn't meant to be that close. It's really considered kind of a conflict. But Lloyd was an extremely powerful man in the world of art. And I apologize for these slides, which is basically the best one can do to get a printout of a Times article from years ago. But Lloyd was a businessman above and beyond anything, and he really had very little interest, I think, in artists or in artwork. And that was a real change from what had gone on in the 50s and 60s in the gallery world in New York. And I think it's something that artists really weren't prepared for. And my father wasn't the only one in his school who made a contract with Marlborough Gallery, and I think many of them lived to regret it. But I mean, what is shown in this picture here is Frank Lloyd on the right having an audience with the Pope. So his clients included people like the Pope, like Queen Elizabeth. He also made sales for the Metropolitan Museum when they needed to sell a work in order, what we call deaccessioning, which museums sometimes do in order to be able to purchase something else for their collection. Marlborough Gallery was intimately involved in those transactions and, in fact, made a great deal of profit on it. So here was this person who had really come in, not just to the New York art world, but really to the international art world, and turned it into a big business, if you will, rather than a small concern where people really cared about the art and the artist. So once we found out about the contracts, things began to move more quickly. So finally, we got information about the contracts. We began to piece together what had happened. I finally convinced, since I could not directly file the lawsuit, I convinced my guardian to file the lawsuit against the gallery and the executors. And it was finally filed in late October of 1971. And as I said, during that period, the gallery had basically had free rein doing whatever they wanted with the paintings. And I think the one thing that helped us is that, significantly, was that the Attorney General's office in New York, an office which deals not with criminal cases, but with non-criminal issues, legal issues, had taken an interest in the case. And they came in and they represented the foundation, which was supposed to be charitable. But in reality, they helped a great deal in presenting evidence during the lawsuit. And that was very helpful because on the other side of the case, where I don't know how many lawyers, Marlborough had two sets of lawyers, one to represent them in New York and one to represent their European galleries. The executors had lawyers, and then in addition, the executors had convinced the entire foundation board to support them in the lawsuit. So the foundation had its own set of lawyers. So lawyers were just proliferating, and I think it was very helpful to us to have the support of the Attorney General's office. And this was just the Attorney General at the time, a very nice man who looks so young to me now. I suppose at the time, I was 21, so he looked like a grown-up, but this is a picture of him as a young man, Gustave Harrow. And then even to get to trial was a battle. Everything seemed to be a battle in this case, and that's why it dragged on for so long. So we had really, except seeing these contracts, we had nothing to go on. And we had, when you call someone to testify in court, normally you call someone who can testify in your favor and give evidence in your favor. But in this case, we really didn't have anyone we could call on our side, as it were. So we were mainly dealing with trying to get information from the other side. So what's trying to interview hostile, witnesses who aren't friendly to you. So it was a very long process, and because of all these lawyers, it got so out of hand that the court actually had to appoint a judge who had retired to try to keep things in order and move things along. So it ended up taking, 2.5 years to put together this evidence. And then finally, in February 1974, we got to the trial. And this trial actually went on for an unusually long time in court. Usually things go a couple months at more, and you can see that this case ran all the way through October 1974, trying to present all the evidence. And basically we accused several things. First of all, and I think I clearly misaligned my slide, so I apologize, but we first of all accused particularly 2 of the 3 executors of having a conflict of interest because one of them actually worked for Marlborough Gallery and the other was given this exhibit and also a very advantageous contract for future sales with the gallery. So we accused those 2 executors of conflict of interest. And then we accuse them and the gallery particularly of both defrauding the estate, not being honest with the estate, not making the payments they were supposed to make to the estate, and actually doing illegal sales. And finally, they tried to cover up these illegal sales by forging the evidence. They had a big, nothing was on the computer at the time, so they had this huge, what they called their stock book, in which they kept all the transactions carefully written. And so they actually called an evidence that we wanted to examine the stock book. And we went to examine it. There were many, many places where things had clearly been erased and changed, or whited out and changed. So we accused them of forging the evidence. And actually, this case was not really ruled on at the time of this trial, but eventually the head of Marlborough Gallery was convicted of forging this evidence in a criminal court years later. A little bit of a joke, because rather than getting any sort of reasonable punishment for doing that, he was asked to have students to his gallery to do community service. So he didn't get a serious, but it was some satisfaction to know that at least he had been convicted of forging the evidence. So now there were many ways in which we felt they had defrauded the estate. The first was that they had bought these paintings for an extremely low price, probably less than half of what my father had been selling for before his death. And it was also discovered that they based it on an evaluation of the works, which was produced basically by a friend of theirs, so who was willing to pretty much say whatever they wanted him to say. So they clearly bought the 100 paintings for a ridiculously low price, and we then had clear evidence that they had then turned around and sold them again to individual buyers, sometimes for 10, 15 times the price they had paid the estate. And second of all, with the paintings that they had not sold outright, sometimes they would sell the painting and then resell it to make and only pay the estate on the low value they had originally sold it for, and not pay them when they sold it 2 months later to another party for triple that price. So they were also not really paying the estate what they should have on the other paintings they were selling. So, clearly not only was the gallery involved in doing this, but they certainly had the executors going along with much of it as well. So, and this is just Frank Lloyd appearing at what's called surrogate's court, which is where any case involving a matter related to a family, including someone's estate, what they leave after their death, would go to surrogate's court. And usually it doesn't hear cases of this size, so I think this was unusual for surrogate's court. And I really show this not to focus on what Lloyd said in his testimony, but to focus on the fact that the one thing that we really thought we had going for this in the face of all these lawyers on the other side and what seemed like just overwhelming odds against us was the fact that the case was being reported on every day in the New York Times and also in a smaller newspaper. And shortly after Lloyd testified, all of a sudden, this one reporter who had been coming, Edith Evans Ashbury, who had been coming every day to court, disappeared. And we wondered what had happened. And what had appeared is that the lawyers on the other side had paid off the New York Times not to appear and report on the case. But because this smaller newspaper wrote this up, suddenly the New York Times reappeared. And I do think that was helpful, because it was at least a way to get out to the public what was going on every day in court. And much of it, I think, as the executors and the people from the gallery gave the evidence, looked pretty bad for them. But still in all, I don't think we really thought we were going to win. And people have also often asked me why I just persisted and persisted and persisted. And I think it was great to be young. First of all, I had a ton of energy to do this, At the same time, I was in medical school, and I don't know quite how. I was always on the telephone, but I was always, in school at the same time. And but I think being young not only gives you energy, but it gives you the idea that if you think you are morally right, you're going to win, which of course isn't very realistic. So I look back and I think it was a combination of my being so convinced I was right because I knew exactly what my father would have wanted to happen with his paintings, because I'd heard so much discussion during my lifetime or during my childhood, and also just feeling that if that was the case, then the judge had to rule in our favor. And there were days when we were certainly very despondent, and I say we because we literally got married on the day, my husband and I, who's sitting in the back, on the day the case was due to come to court. Or, I'm sorry, 2 days before the case was due to come to court. So I very much had his support, as well as during a couple years before that as well. But I think, it was very discouraging because everyone I had known as a child in the art world, there were 500 people at my father's funeral. And all of a sudden, I had 5 people supporting me. And I always say maybe I should have realized it when there were only 10 people who appeared at my mother's funeral, 6 months after my father died. Maybe I should have realized that many of those people were only coming to the funeral because my father was famous and that they weren't really good friends. But I guess I didn't take that warning, and it was still a surprise when basically no one would talk to me during the trial. And not only that, but people were making comments to the newspaper about me. For example, the painter Jackson Pollock, who was, very much of the New York school my father was in, his estate was with Marlborough, and his widow, another artist, Lee Krasner, who was running the estate, was frequently talking to the newspaper and telling them in not such pleasant terms, but saying in much more unpleasant terms that you have to be an idiot to oppose Marlborough. So there were constantly things in the background like that, which made us pessimistic, despite my eternal naive approach and optimism. But, so we basically, sat through the trial really thinking in the back of our minds, and I think my husband even more than I was, that it was really unlikely that we were going to win the case, and who knows what was going to happen if we didn't. And this is just a picture of the judge. I felt the poor judge who wasn't really used to listening to this kind of case. And then suddenly, in December of 1975, a decision came down in our favor. And what that meant is, first of all, the 3 executors were removed, and they did decide to remove all 3 of them because the third person, even if he didn't have a conflict of interest, had not stood up to the other 2 executors. And the gallery and the executors were given a large fine. And basically, although they were not absolutely told in the decision they had to return the paintings, but it basically resulted in the fact that almost all the paintings that had not been sold to that date were returned to the estate. So out of almost 800 paintings my father had that were in his estate when he died, about 700 of them were returned, so a significant number. Now, it was frustrating, of course, that paintings from those 100 paintings that had been sold directly to the gallery and then sold to collectors did not come back to us. But hopefully they were sold to people who really, by and large, cared about the work, and hopefully, some of those have made their way into museum collections since then. But everything else was to be returned. So this was basically, I think, the best judgment we probably could have hoped for. And this is just to emphasize that no one thought we were going to win. Everyone thought we would lose. So, however, as my husband now tells me he always suspected, he says he thought we might have won, but we were never going to be able to do what they say, collect on the judgment, that somehow the gallery and the executors were going to avoid paying the fine or returning the works of art. And indeed, on Christmas Eve of 1975, suddenly the Attorney General's office gets an anonymous call that something, that the Marlborough Gallery is trying to remove their assets from New York by taking them out through Canada. And that is why, I don't know, someone named it the Toronto Caper, because they were trying to take works out through Toronto. But this was, of course, a crazy time for this to happen. Not only was there this huge rush, but it was also Christmas Eve. So the lawyers, a group of lawyers, including people from the Attorney General's office and our lawyer, run up to Toronto. But Toronto, of course, Canada has its own laws, so they had to find a judge in Toronto on Christmas Eve who wanted to sign an order that would allow them to stop Marlborough Gallery from taking their paintings, and both their artistic assets as well as their cash assets out of the country. And somehow they managed to do this and literally caught the plane as it was about to take off on the runway. So my husband was proven correct. However, the day was saved and they were not able to remove their assets, and that therefore forced their hand to pay the fine and or return the paintings. And as I said, ultimately, most of the paintings were returned. So, in a sense, that's the end of the story, because I had really accomplished, if not 100% of what I wanted to accomplish, everything that could be accomplished under the circumstances, because works that had been sold to legitimate collectors could not be returned. And that might have been the end of the story, except of course the gallery and the executors were unhappy. So at least in New York State, you can take this to 2 levels of appeal. So things were already going on starting in 1976 after the first ruling, and I ended up being appointed basically as the new executors, and gradually the paintings were returned, and I had help, cataloging them and documenting what came back and finding storage for them and things. We paid estate taxes, as you have to do everywhere, so that was another burden to get over. And then, thanks to the Attorney General, they actually set up a new foundation with totally new board of directors. And I was not involved in that directly, since I was the executor and therefore should not have been on the foundation board despite the original board. So that was 1976. But in the meantime, we were waiting for these 2 levels of appeal. So it wasn't until the end of 1977, almost 8 years after my father died, that the final decision came down and basically completely supported the original decision of 1975. So that was really the culmination of what we wanted, and I guess you could say in and this is just something to give you an idea of the amount of paperwork that built up in those years, of which we saved some but not all, or haven't had a chance to go through all of it. But we felt there really needed to be a celebration. The works were back, and we wanted to have those seen by the public. So the first thing we really did once the final decision came down and all the paintings were back, was to arrange a retrospective exhibit of really a collection of my father's whole body of his works from the beginning of his career till the end. And this ended up opening at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in the fall of 1978. And these are just some pictures from that exhibit, just the paintings. I don't know if the Guggenheim Museum is interesting, and it's built like a spiral down. And we were a little concerned that it would not work well for seeing the paintings, but it actually worked very well because there were these niches as you went down where you could basically fit 2 large canvases in most cases into each division. And it actually worked very well for seeing the paintings. And what made us most happy is how many people came to see the exhibit. It was really extremely well attended, which was nice to see that in those 8 years the public, had not lost interest and was excited to come back and see the paintings in a museum setting. So, I will close there. This is just a picture of the catalog of the show, and this was nice because the Guggenheim ended up purchasing this particular painting from the estate, and it's in their permanent collection now, which was a nice culmination as well. Whoops. So I'll close there. I don't know if anyone has any immediate questions about the talk. Yes?
I always wondered, after your father unfortunately passed away, what happened to his brushes?
I'm sorry?
What happened to his brushes?
His brushes. I don't know. No, I won't say I don't know. I suspect that they were just swept up by Marlborough Gallery because Marlborough Gallery, there were all sorts of interesting details, but one detail was within a week after my father's death, Marlborough Gallery had taken over the rental of his studio and moved operations of their own into the studio. So I suspect they simply disappeared in that process. But whether someone swept in, one of the executors even before that, and swept them up, I don't know.
So for the benefit of the live stream, the question was about Kate's father's brushes. So what happened to them after he died?
Yeah, thank you. I should have repeated that because I realize it's hard to hear. Anyone else?
First of all, an amazing story, Bravo, because I remember the BBC documentary in 2000. Your father was going to put work into the Four Seasons Hotel, and then I believe your mother and your father went to have dinner there. And your father said, people who can afford a meal like that, I don't want them seeing my work. His original plan was that the art would be seen by the workers of the hotel in the canteen. Your father, I don't think, ever wanted people to feast financially on his art. And what Marlborough Gallery did was atrocious. It took them another 50 years before they finally folded, and that story was repeated with other artists. So bravo on that. And I thought it was rather poignant because the 1975 ruling was the 18th of December, which is my birthday. The 1977 ruling was the 22nd of November, my mother's birthday. And I find things like that rather weird. But what you've done here in Daugavpils and what you've done with the Rothko, with your father's works around the world, touches us all. And bravo on you and your husband. That story was so personal. And I think it's a story that needs to be told. Because as a gallerist, we're not all that bad, but there is a world where art is created for its beauty and not always for its financial attraction. And those that tried to feed on your father's legacy were stopped by you as a young girl planning her own life, realizing that something was wrong. So I just want to say bravo.
Thank you.
Have you ever seen any of your father's paintings that were sold originally by Marlborough Gallery, like resurfaced in somewhere else?
Yeah, Certainly works have resurfaced over the years, been resold. For example, I had a favorite work growing up because it was always hanging in our living room, and it was unique because it was the only work my father gave a name to that was painted after 1950. It was an homage to, he called it homage to Matisse because he was so fond of Matisse's work. And I had always adored that painting, and apparently whoever bought it initially from Marlborough Gallery was a business, and they simply put it in their vault. And the fear was it would never be seen. And about, I'm trying to think, 15 years ago maybe, it came up again at auction and resurfaced. And while I knew it was sort of out of the realm of possibility for me to have it back, it was at least nice to see that it went to a serious collector who hopefully and who was interested in hanging it, and hopefully eventually will give it to a museum. So that was a nice thing. It was somewhat more upsetting to realize that things would sometimes appear on the market out of paintings that Marlborough hadn't sold to another buyer, but they had made the decision, instead of returning them to reduce their fine, they decided to keep them for the future. And that was painful to know that some of those were reappearing on the market. And there was nothing to do at that point. But, again, hopefully they went to serious collectors who also want to lend them to be seen by the public, and hopefully eventually give them to museums. I think a lot of collectors do end up doing that if their family really isn't interested in keeping them, or it's impossible financially or whatever. So I will hope those wind up in the museums. Thanks. Sure.
I understand, Kate, that you were given a list of questions from the people who sent them in advance. I realize we might not have the time for all of them, but maybe one or two that stood out to you and that you would like to answer now before we end our event.
Well, I have a question here about learning about Rothko's method, and that is really a complex question. I think we are constantly learning new things about Rothko's method, particularly as analysis abilities become greater and greater for museums. We're always learning more about materials that he used. Every time, and hopefully this isn't too many times, but whenever there has been damage to a work of art, we have been able to learn new things about the composition of a work. The one thing, and it's also very hard to speak to this because obviously his methods changed drastically in the different periods of his paintings. The one thing I think is very clear in his works from 1950 on, his classic works, is that there is a great deal of layering in the works, even though they appear extremely thinly painted. There are often layers and layers underneath the final layer, which actually give a very different final color, especially because each one is put on essentially as a veil of paint. Obviously he used different materials at different times. Very often he mixed some of his own pigment. He was back to sort of the Renaissance approach of using egg in his paints. He also used, prepared oil paints, and then toward the end of his career, these last works that you see that I showed are painted in acrylic, which was new for him. Let's see, another question. Oh, there's so many here. Let's see. Well, one is about my most vivid memories when I received the first news and letters from Daugavpils. And I guess my first contact with Daugavpils was through Farida Zilatilo when she visited us. We were at the time living in Washington, D.C., visited me and my husband in Washington, D.C. In 2002, and she was already well into the preparation phase for her amazing project for his 2003 centenary celebration here. And it was just amazing to hear what had already been accomplished. And I just remember our having a very nice lunch together, which was enhanced by my husband's ability to communicate in Russian. We otherwise might have been a little lost with each other at the time, but that, you know, really enhanced our communication. And, you know, but I think when I came here and learned how much information she had unearthed, not just about my father's work, but also about his family connections to Daugavpils, and how she's continued to do that over the years, that has really made us as a family feel much more connected to the city. And that's been very important too. So I appreciate that. And I can only say every time I come back, I feel a new connection. I wish my father had had the opportunity to reconnect in such a positive way with Daugavpils.
Maybe a third one. I realize we probably won't cover all of them, but maybe a third question also from the list, number 3. Yeah. 2 and 3.
So one more, you think? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's see here. Well, one of the questions is about whether I feel it would be good to bring more attention to Rothko as a personality. Obviously, most of the attention since his death has been, related to his artwork. And I guess I can say yes in the sense there is one serious biography of my father, and the research in it is meticulous, so there are a lot of factual details which we wouldn't otherwise have, although I always like to point out that in that biography there is a specific house in Daugavpils which was pointed out as my father's home, and since then we have unearthed, I should say, Farida has unearthed the information that that is indeed not correct, but unfortunately the original home isn't standing. There is a gas station. But by and large, the research was very, detailed and precise, and I think we learned a lot from it. But I think the approach to the biography is very psychoanalytical, and I'm not sure it really gives a full view, the fullest view from different perspectives that I would like of my father. So what I would like to see is more people, and I'm not suggesting myself, but more people write some serious biographical material on him from different perspectives. I would really like to see that done because we have things like the play Red, which I think grossly misrepresented my father's personality and is now out there in the public as quote unquote biographical. And when I see that happening, that's indeed very painful. So I think it would be good. So I'll challenge someone to write another in-depth biography.
Thank you, Kate. And with this, I believe we will wrap up this wonderful talk and also the live stream. On behalf of the Rothko Museum, I thank Kate for her presence here at Mark Rothko's 122nd birthday. Again, for the donation, for the generous donation of 2 original drawings, early period drawings by Mark Rothko, to the Rothko Museum collection. And also I will thank the audience for joining us tonight here at the Rothko Museum and online. Thank you so much. The Rothko Museum will keep on working to preserving Mark Rothko's legacy and to putting it out there into the public eye for all of us to keep being inspired by it and to keep learning more and more about it.
Thank you.